What if I told you that the blueprint to save the euro from a future potentially catastrophic collapse already exists? That a strong consensus has formed among leading economic minds, from the IMF to Nobel laureates, on the essential steps needed to secure Europe's long-term prosperity. The plans are on the table. The economics are sound. But you will likely never see them happen. Hi everyone, I'm Economou, a PhD economist. What I will analyze in this video isn't a story about a lack of knowledge. It's a story about a lack of political will. This is the story of Europe's impossible reforms and why the very policies needed to secure the continent's future are seen as a political suicide for the national leaders who would have to implement them. It's the story of a massive, dangerous gap between what is economically necessary and what is politically achievable. And in that gap, the entire European project is hanging in the balance. Now, before I continue, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. It will only help ideas like this one be viewed by more curious minds like you. To understand why Europe is in such a precarious position, you have to look past today's headlines. As of early 2025, the continent's economy seems to be in a period of relative calm. Growth is moderate, inflation is easing, and the job market is holding strong, but it's a deceptive calm. The Eurozone, in its current form, is a structure built for fair weather. It's proven remarkably resilient, but its foundations have a critical design flaw, one that was brutally exposed during the sovereign debt crisis over a decade ago and has never been fully repaired. That flaw is the inherent contradiction of having a single monetary policy set by the European Central Bank, but 17 different fiscal policies run by 17 national governments with 17 different priorities and 17 election cycles. Imagine a single ship, a single vessel with 17 captains. It's holding their own map and trying to steer. In calm seas, they might just about manage to sail in the same general direction. But when a storm hits, when a crisis strikes one part of the fleet harder than another, the entire vessel is pulled in competing directions. This is what economists call an asymmetric shock. A housing bubble bursting in Spain isn't the same as an industrial slowdown in Germany. In the old days, Spain could have devalued its currency, the peseta, to make its exports cheaper and regain competitiveness. But inside the Eurozone, that tool is gone. There is only the euro. This leaves countries with fewer options to absorb these shocks, often forcing them into painful internal devaluations, a gentle term for slashing wages and public spending, which leads to years of high unemployment and social unrest. The last crisis revealed a terrifying feedback loop, which became known as the doom loop. When a government gets into too much debt, it spooks the investors who buy its bonds, but who are often the biggest buyers of a country's government bonds, its own domestic banks. So, as the government stability comes into question, so does the stability of its banks. As the banks begin to wobble, the government has to step in to bail them out, taking even more debt and making its own situation worse. The government and the banks drag each other down in a spiral that threatens to shatter the entire financial system. The EU has patched this system together with emergency funds and new oversight bodies, but the fundamental flaw remains. The competitiveness gaps between the export-heavy North and the less productive South persists. The Union has made incremental improvements, like the new economic governance framework implemented in 2024, which tries to balance debt sustainability with investment. But these are tweaks to a system that many argue needs a complete overhaul. They are trying to fireproof a wooden house when what economists are screaming for is a house made of stone, because everyone knows another storm is inevitable. The question isn't if, but when, and whether the house, as it stands right now, can possibly survive it. So what is the cornerstone of this stone house that so many economists believe in necessary? It's a concept that is both profoundly logical and, in the current European climate, profoundly radioactive: a fiscal union. In its most ambitious form, this means creating something like a European Treasury. This would involve two major transformative ideas. First, the issuance of common debt, often called Eurobonds. Instead of Italy, Greece, Germany, blah blah blah, issuing their own separate bonds with widely different interest rates, the Eurozone as a whole would borrow on the markets, backed by the collective economic might of all its members. This would create a massive, deep, and incredibly safe financial asset, a true rival to the US Treasury bill, which would lower borrowing costs for everyone and strengthen the Euro's role on the global stage. Second, it would mean creating a centralized EU budget with real power, not just for funding agriculture or regional development, but for macroeconomic stabilization. This budget would act as an automatic shock absorber. If one country, say Finland for example, were to enter a deep recession, funds would automatically flow from the central budget, perhaps through a common unemployment insurance scheme, to support Finnish workers and cushion the blow. This helps prevent a local crisis from spiraling into a Eurozone-wide catastrophe. This isn't some radical idea. It's exactly how the federal government in the United States stabilizes the economies of individual states. The IMF has argued for years that without this kind of risk sharing, the Eurozone will remain dangerously vulnerable. It's economically sound. It's logical. It would likely solve the Eurozone's deepest structural problems. So, why is it a political non-starter? Because for any national leader, championing it would be political suicide. To create a fiscal union, you would need to change the fundamental treaties of the European Union. This isn't just a directive from Brussels. It often requires national referendums and constitutional amendments. Now imagine you are the Chancellor of Germany or the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. You have to stand before your voters and say, I want to take a portion of our national budget, our tax revenue, and put it in a central pot. And yes, some of that money will automatically be transferred to other countries if they get into trouble. We will be permanently on the hook for the debts of other nations. This is the narrative of the transfer union, and it is the ultimate boogeyman for fiscally conservative Northern European countries. The fear, amplified by populist media, is that hard-working German savers and Dutch pensioners will be forced to endlessly bail out supposedly reckless southern nations. It doesn't matter if the economic reality is far more complex. The political messaging is simple, powerful, and toxic. No mainstream politician who wants to be re-elected can champion this cause. The resistance is so profound that even the EU's recent reforms like the 2024 Economic Governance Framework were painstakingly designed to avoid anything that looks like debt mutualization or a true fiscal union. They reinforce national ownership of fiscal plans precisely because ceding that power is politically unthinkable. So Europe is left with a halfway house, a shared currency without a shared treasury, an economic union without a political glue to hold it together. The doom loop between struggling governments and their banks was the epicenter of the last crisis. The solution, which experts agreed on almost immediately, was to create a full banking union. The idea was to break that toxic link by making bank safety a shared European responsibility. Two of the three pillars of this union are largely in place. The European Central Bank now acts as the single supervisor for the biggest banks, and there is a single resolution mechanism to wind down failing banks in an orderly way. But the crucial final piece, the capstone of the entire structure, is still missing. It's called the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, or EDIS. It's a simple concept, a common insurance fund financed by banks themselves that would guarantee deposits up to 100,000 euros anywhere in the Eurozone. This would stop a bank run in one country from becoming a contagion. If people in Portugal knew their savings were backed by a fund representing the entire European economy, not just the Portuguese government, they would have no reason to panic and pull their money out. It would short-circuit a crisis before it could even begin and sever the doom loop for good. So why, after more than a decade of discussion, is this critical reform still stalled? Once again, it comes down to politics and a deep-seated lack of trust. The conversation hits the exact same wall as the Fiscal Union. For a German politician, supporting the EDIS sounds like telling German savers that they will be on the hook for depositors at a failing Italian or Greek bank. It's the fear of being liable for legacy risks, hiding in other countries' banking systems. Northern countries have demanded that southern banks first clean up their balance sheets before they will even consider sharing the burden. Southern countries argue that the risk sharing itself is what's needed to create a stable system for everyone. The result is a decade-long standoff. Progress has completely stalled, leaving the Eurozone dangerously exposed to the same bank-government doom loop in the next crisis. This political paralysis extends to another area crying out for reform: tax policy. In a true single market, companies should compete on the quality of their products, not on their ability to find the lowest tax rate. But in the EU, every member state sets its own corporate tax policy. This has triggered what is essentially a race to the bottom. Countries like Ireland and Luxembourg have famously used ultra-low corporate tax rates to attract the headquarters of multinational giants. This allows corporations to book profits generated across the entire EU in a single low-tax jurisdiction, eroding the tax base of larger countries like France, Germany, and Spain. Many economists argue that some form of taxation harmonization, setting a minimum corporate tax rate, for example, is essential for fairness. It would create a level playing field and ensure that megacorporations contribute fairly to the societies where they actually make their money. The political obstacle here is perhaps the most absolute of all. Taxation is seen as one of the final sacred pillars of national sovereignty. The power to tax is the power to govern. For many smaller nations, their low tax rates are a key part of their economic model. Giving up that power to Brussels is simply unthinkable. And to make matters even worse, any change to EU tax policy requires an anonymous vote from all 27 member states, getting every single country from Ireland to Malta to Hungary to agree to give up their veto power on their own tax code isn't just politically difficult. Under the current rules, it's a practical impossibility. Beyond the high finance of fiscal and banking unions, there is a third category of reforms that economists see as vital for Europe's long-term health: structural reforms at the national level. This is where the abstract debates in Brussels crash into the daily lives of citizens. Structural reform is the sterile term for changing the fundamental rules of a country's economy to boost productivity. This often means liberalizing labor markets to make it easier to hire and fire workers, reforming pension systems by raising the retirement age, or cutting red tape for businesses. In theory, these changes make an economy more dynamic and lead to growth in the long run. The thinking goes that if Southern European economies in particular undertook these reforms, the competitiveness gap between the North and South would shrink, relieving much of the tension inside the Eurozone. But here, the gap between economic prescription and political reality becomes a chasm. Imagine you're the president of France. economists from the European Commission are telling you that to secure your country's future, you need to announce that the retirement age will increase by 2 years and that unemployment benefits will be trimmed. You know what happens next, right? The streets of Paris will fill with hundreds of thousands of protesters. The union will call for paralyzing strikes. Your approval rating will plummet overnight. You're asking people to accept very real short-term pain for a promise of long-term gain, one that's based on complex economic models that feel distant and abstract. Worse still, these reforms are often perceived as being dictated by Brussels. This plays directly into the hands of populist and nationalist movements, who frame it as a loss of sovereignty to unelected technocratic elites. A national leader is forced to choose, implement a policy that is economically correct, but could get them thrown out of office, or resist the reform and win the next election. More often than not, they choose political survival. This reveals the deepest, most intractable problem of all, the EU's democratic deficit. For millions of Europeans, the EU is a distant, opaque entity. Key decisions feel like they're made in a backroom, deals between heads of state or by a commission that isn't directly accountable to the average citizen. This perception, whether entirely fair or not, erodes the public trust needed to push through difficult but necessary changes. Without public buy-in, there can be no sustained reform. And without reform, the underlying economic problems fester. This creates a vicious cycle. The EU structure prevents it from solving its economic problems, and that failure further fuels public skepticism towards the EU itself. National governments are wary of losing influence, and citizens are wary of giving more power to an institution they already feel is too remote. So we are left with a profound and dangerous paradox. The experts at the IMF, the OECD, and the European Commission itself have a clear diagnosis of the Eurozone's ailments and a clear prescription: a deeper fiscal union, a completed banking union, and coordinated structural reforms. These are the impossible reforms. They are impossible not because they are economically unsound, but because they are politically toxic. They clash with the most powerful forces in national politics: sovereignty, self-interest, and the simple fear of losing control. The result is a union perpetually stuck in a half-built state. It has a single currency and a single market, but it lacks the shared treasury and political foundation to make it truly resilient. The patches made since the last crisis were designed to get through the next few years, not the next few decades. They don't fix the foundational cracks. The continent remains vulnerable, waiting for the next major economic shock to test its fragile construction. It seems transformative change won't come from careful planning. It will likely only be forced upon Europe by another devastating crisis, a crisis that will once again threaten the entire project and compel its leaders to finally truly consider the impossible. But what do you think? What could possibly break this political deadlock? Does it require a new generation of leaders? Or will it take the heat of another full-blown crisis to forge a stronger union? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this analysis insightful, please give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Thank you all for watching and see you in the next one. Bye bye.